feel free, you guys, to like keep the among the silence thing. We don't want to compel you to have that one.
In 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this debate today. Firstly on setup, and secondly 2 points of substantive. So firstly, I just wanted to set up in the status quo what is currently the norm in the queer movement. We think there looks like a lot of specific labels, such as like pansexual, omnisexual, and then gendered labels such as like demi-genders and things like that, that we would talk about as being specific labels in the queer movement. I feel like under the status quo, there's a lot of pressure to find these labels and to categorize yourself within movements. So why is this? Well, we feel like just like on the ground, like these categories sort of determine like what events you can go to, what kind of people you can relate to within your movement. Like when you're talking in like talking rooms and conversations, like when you have to like disclose what label you identify with. I feel like a lot of the time people just feel very comfortable within the movement asking you explicitly like what is your label, like what do you identify with, and then now you need to give like a very quick and like categorical answer to that. So that's why there's a lot of pressure within the movement to use these labels in the first place. They are quite important. The counterfactual for this, which is like outlined in the topic, is that people would instead on the outside be talking about like labels that are more general, such as like queer, non-binary, gender not conforming, or diverse. These are labels that sort of are umbrella terms that fit a lot of people within them. So before I like get into my substantive, I just kind of wanted to outline debate and like the goals of the movement in general. So I feel like the goals of the queer movement can be put on sort of 2 levels. Firstly, just on like a personal level, they want to find like acceptance and provide like a safe space for individuals that are otherwise marginalized by like the like heteronormative mainstream society, right? And they also want like social change of this narrative. They want to like resist heteronormativity and rigid gender binaries that are really damaging to a lot of queer people on the ground, right? So these are things like gender essentialism and all that kind of stuff. Note that those sort of really harmful narratives often use labels as like weapons to try and like categorize people into like mainstream categories as well. So my first point is why we get like greater belonging within the queer community and greater acceptance when we don't have these hyper-specific labels. So first on that one, we get more accessibility of the movement in general, right? We think that it increases the bar for like access and acceptance in queer communities when you have to like learn and familiarize yourself with like a bunch of hyper-specific labels. The impact of this is that like people living in areas, for example, like rural and regional areas, conservative areas especially, or just people who are not like really deeply entrenched in queer spaces that have had that around them like their whole lives, take on like a very heavy burden to like learn and familiarize themselves with these labels if they want to find acceptance within the community, right? I think a lot of the times, like not being familiar with these labels is a really strong barrier to entry, because then you don't feel comfortable like talking to people, and you don't feel comfortable like referring to people because you feel like, I don't know, you don't know enough about the movement, or like you go to like say or you're going to like incorrectly identify people, things like that. We think the weighing of this is that it is often the most marginalized people, so the people in conservative areas that are having the most hate directed towards them because of their identity, who now feel like they cannot they cannot find acceptance, or they cannot access the very community that is supposed to like be a safe haven for them against all of this backlash and the hate that they're getting in their personal lives because they live in like, I don't know, a regional area in which like there's a lot of homophobia or transphobia, right? Okay, so another important thing in this speech that I wanted to touch on is why these labels just do not work in the first place, and why people do not fit into these labels. So I think that people feel like attraction and gender in a variety of ways, and it's very much a spectrum in this sense, right? It's like based on a lot of things, and it changes, and it's variable throughout your life based on a lot of things, based on like your environment, your experiences, the people around you, right? There's a huge variance in how one person experiences gender and sexuality versus like how another person experiences, even if they may share the same like hyper-specific label, right? I think another thing is that this is largely changing throughout your life. So the adherence to hyper-specific labels is a continuous thing like throughout a queer person's life, right? They have to keep like checking themselves whether they still identify with this hyper-specific label, and if they do not, they might feel internal discord, or like, oh, I used to identify with this, and now I feel like my like experiences have changed, and like now I'm confused about who I am, right? So yeah, so that's that. Even if there is a label, I think, for what people are feeling, it is often very specific and quite niche, like because people's experiences are so specific and niche and they shape who they are in that way. So when you tell those like other people what your label is, they might often like not understand it, or like you then take on a burden of explaining that to them, right? So the impact of that is you just feel like, or people just feel like alienated from the communities that they're in, because they don't either don't feel like they have a label that fits them, or they feel like it is their burden to like explain that label very heavily to people. So, okay, thirdly, I kind of touched on this before, but there is just currently like a narrative that you need to find your label, or that your goal in life, or at least within the queer movement, is to find your label. I think this leads to a lot of like, or this stems from people, there being a lot of pressure to disclose your label in queer spaces. People like ask you, what is your label? And also just the idea that like if you don't quite know yet, then you're like not really like, then you're not really, if you don't quite know your label yet, then your like experience is not particularly valid within the community, right? Okay, so the fourth point under this like why we get greater belonging within the queer community is that currently single groups are often like signalled out for discrimination within the queer community by their peers, right? For example, we give you like, you know, things like biphobia, where like people are or like bisexual people feel like they don't, or are often targeted as being less valid than their like gay or lesbian counterparts, right? And that's sort of like a real problem within the community and creates a lot of divide within the queer community. Note that like social movements always want to be a unified front. It's always better for them in the long run, where we don't have internal divide or discord, right? We think when these labels don't exist, it just like, it means they can't be used as battering rams against people who identify with them. The impact of this is we just get more collectivization within the movement, which is always good. Yeah, so the impacting here is that people is that currently people like feel more alienated within the queer community. These are the people who feel alienated in like conservative areas or rural areas are the people who need to feel the most accepted, because they're people experiencing the most discrimination. That's why you should weigh that really highly. I think in the absence of these labels, where you leave people to like just experience their gender and their sexuality for what it is, then like, I don't know, they feel a lot more comfortable in themselves in that way. I think the impact again, like further of lack of accessibility is that people are just like reluctant to join, and there's greater incentive to leave as well. So I think we also quickly get just a greater social capacity of the movement, which is obviously very important for them. So two parts to this. Firstly, people are just more likely to be in the movement. There's a greater scale of the movement because there's like, we're not alienating a bunch of people. The capacity then becomes stronger in a sense, like you can do more activism, you get more people at rallies, like you get a bigger voting bloc, right? That was always going to be good for the movement. You also just gain more legitimacy of the movement in the mainstream, right? We think the success of movements is also largely based on its reception by the mainstream or people in power, which maybe is not the best thing, but like is how it currently is. I think you get greater legitimacy of movements in moderate or conservative spaces, because like currently a lot of specific labels are like ridiculed or used as conservative weaponry, right? Therefore, sorry, I'm like really out of time here, but proud to propose.
Before I start my speech, I just want to make it clear that my speech is not reflected on my personal views. Yeah. The issue with the affirmatives' claims is that they assume that every individual or every individual who is part of the LGBTQ community is the same, or that they can broadly accept into a certain community, and that community is able to represent every single individual's interests. We don't believe so. We're so proud to be gay. two arguments in this speech. But before that, I just want to do some responsive material first. This idea that there's pressure on you to be accepted into a specific community. I think one, the queerness exists where you're not sure whether which sexuality you belong to, and often that is accepted within the LGBTQ community. That you know that you're not straight, but you are part of something which you're just not sure. Second thing is that often there's an emphasis on things like intersectionality and things like that. So broadly this acceptance among groups in our system. So first argument then on why we're better for queer individuals. First bit of framing in this argument. The first thing to note here is that our capacity to impact social change is very limited. That is to say that the right-wing individual in Texas is unlikely to change on either side of the house. We think then, considering our capacity to change is limited, the most important stakeholder in this debate is the individual, and the individual LGBTQ members who need to feel represented, who need to feel that their interests are taken at large, are being represented, and they feel better. First point of analysis on this argument, on narrative domination. I want to note here that considering this retrospective debate, notice as to how oftentimes gay men or twinks were the ones initially who started the LGBTQ movement with things like Stonewall. These individuals had significant amount of capital, had huge amount of social standing, and were historically the individuals who were part of the LGBTQ movement. That is to say, panel, given this then, the image of the LGBTQ movement is mainly associated with being a white man. Comparatively then, if you associate an entire movement with the individuals who have this most social economic capital, who are then able to dominate that certain space, you're able to crowd out other individuals or other individuals who are important. So lesbian issues and lesbian experiences are crowded out by the umbrella LGBTQ problems, and we don't think that specificity is awarded to them. Why is our side better? Because on our side panel, we focus on the individual experiences. We discuss personal experiences of individuals. And so individuals like otters and bears are able to talk about their issues, and considering we prioritize individual experiences, they're able to get a certain space in the community. Crucially then, on their side of the house, because there's no emphasis on individual experiences, you're more likely to do three things. One, you're more likely to trivialize experiences to be one clump for everyone, but also people feel that they're not heard, that my individual experiences as a person aren't taken accounted for. The third thing to note here, it's very difficult to find an identity if there is no vocal or individual voicing that they're different experiences. If you're just saying gay but not looking at the nuances of it, it's very difficult for individuals to attach their individual identity towards this. The second thing to note here, and the second part of this argument, is that being queer or being part of this movement is oftentimes very confusing. So oftentimes it's very difficult for you to understand what you're attracted to. For example, you might feel as a man you are attracted to other men. So you might feel that you are a trans woman, but you find that other aspects of your identity are more linked towards a gay man. This is crucial, panel, because we think it's a very confusing process, but additionally, we think considering this is a very difficult portion of your life where you're not really sure who you are, you're acting under duress and you're acting under tremendous amounts of stress. So you're facing a significant amount of confusion as to what your identity is. Crucially then, why do we fix this? Because we show individuals that there are specific aspects of specific groups that best resemble their experiences. So as a trans individual who has aspects of a gay man, you're likely to find specific community on our side of the house. And the reason for that is we're able to show specific aspects and vocalize those kinds of things in society. Comparatively then on their side of the house, there's a sea of narratives that exists on their side, and it's very difficult for you to accommodate for those things. The third thing to note here is that often, and the third part of this argument is that oftentimes people face different issues. The issues faced by gay men, the issues faced by lesbians are very different to individuals who face who are bisexual. For example, bisexual individuals may feel like things like bi erasure or that bi women not being believed. Crucially then, we think that considering that individuals are different, people have different issues, and the way the world interacts with different LGBTQ groups are different, it's very important to recognize, to treat these groups very differently, considering their issues and the way the world interacts with them is differently. On proposition, you don't discuss the specific problems these individuals have. So the experiences and the problems that you have are very different. Why is this bad then? Two reasons. One, you feel completely unheard because no one's talking about the specific issues faced by black trans women in a particular country. The second thing to note here is that often you don't have any communication, because if there's no overarching voice dealing with specific individuals and specific rights, oftentimes there's no discussion about these problems, which means if you do not have this discussion, the probability of you getting solutions to these problems rapidly reduces on their side of the house as well. What are the two impacts then on this argument? First, I think we're able to get better acceptance on our three impacts. Firstly, on acceptance. We think we're able to get better acceptance because now you're able to find yourself far better. Because now you know there's a specific group that you can identify with. The second thing to note here, we're likely to get better change because now you're able to, not lump everyone together, but focus on specific problems that individuals have. The last thing then is also able to get better representation because now you feel that you are not alone in these feelings. When you're in a sea of other individuals, you feel that there is a group that you can associate with, and that representation is important. Second argument then is on why we're better for change. Two pushes in this argument. Considering in the first argument, I've proven to you that people face unique issues, therefore the legislative change that you want to advocate for is oftentimes very specific and very different. For example, a trans man has access to things like testosterone, but oftentimes other aspects that trans women face, such as I don't know the opposite of testosterone, but in considering that it's very hard to access those kinds of things, we think there are specific issues that you need to advocate for. Lump them all together, it's very hard to advocate for the specific nuances that you need in specific change. Because on affirmative, considering that no individuality is brought up, that small levels of advocacy that you need are unlikely to occur. Comparatively on our side of the house, we think as we focus on individual experiences, and the queer movement is often just very intersectional and supports every little piece of nuance that exists in the queer movement, we're likely to get more specific changes that target specific individuals and likely to get them better on our side of the house. The second part of this argument is going to prove to you why we're likely to get better change. Crucially, oftentimes people have specific objections to the queer movement. For example, individuals are oftentimes okay with gay men, but they're against people like lesbians or trans women. And oftentimes these rejections are based on two things. Firstly, it's oftentimes unusually specific religious objections, like that specifically target one group of individual, but it also looks like people finding excuses to target one person in this group. This is crucial, panel, because I think what happens on affirmatives world is that if you lump the entire LGBTQ movement under one thing, it's very difficult for specific gender minorities to advocate for change. And the best example here is the trans bathroom issue, where because of the trans bathroom issue, oftentimes the entire LGBTQ movement was bogged down in trying to solve that specific issue, and the entire movement was unable to get for change. Comparatively on our side of the house though, considering you're able to advocate for different pieces and different nuances in the movement, we think that even though one part is bogged down, you're able to advocate for different individuals and they are able to progress in society rapidly increases. For all of these reasons, we urge you to affirm. Sorry. I'll go.
Okay, 4 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm just going to go over some final substantive on capacity for social change, as well as why and how the queer movement celebrates individuality. Secondly, some rebuttal on intersectionality and representation, and then finally, just some whipping on belonging within the community. So firstly, on capacity for social change, I think that the final thing to add here is that we achieve greater legitimacy in the mainstream, right? So the success of movements is largely based on their reception by the mainstream of people in power, which in our current world and the world that has existed for ever is heteronormative, cisgender normative world, which is not necessarily super open-minded to very niche ideas of what identity could look like. I think what we get is greater legitimacy of the movement in moderately conservative spaces that make queer people in them feel safer to participate in those conversations. I think what we see under the status quo is a lot of specific identities which are being ridiculed and used weaponized by conservatives against the queer community because they do not see those as a legitimate form of expression. I think that this looks like the examples that Cheryl gives you, like omnisexual, pansexual, demisexual, agender, things that really focus on hyper-specific elements of identity rather than those broader terms such as transgender, such as gay, such as queer. And I think that this is extremely harmful to the movement's capacity for social change because they are not taken seriously because people are less willing to understand more niche aspects of identity like that. I think that, like, secondly, on like why the queer movement celebrates individuality, and I think that this does respond very clearly to the substantive at first. So I think that what we see is like the purpose of the queer movement is to denounce the normativity of heterosexuality and cisgender people. By its nature, it recognizes the importance of embracing yourself as who you are. It is designed to create a safe space and a sense of belonging for people who do not fit into those norms. Under the status quo, I think that we don't see this because there is this need to label every aspect of your sexual and gender identity, and this creates binaries and a pressure to adhere to them. I think Cheryl gives you a lot of material on this. I think what this looks like is like, as we tell you, like there's like a big kind of normalization of just point blank asking people how they identify and expecting them to be able to identify like every hyper niche aspect of yourself. I think that this looks like, teenagers on Tumblr talking about like whether they're demisexual or like pansexual or not, and like pressuring other people to fit into a label. I think there is a massive culture of that in the queer community that is created by the existence of these hyper specific labels. And I think that what this does is this erases this idea of the ability to be like an individual and this recognition that it is like a spectrum, right? And that like every single person is going to have an individual experience, and that it is not possible to put every single person, every aspect of their identity into a particular label, which is what the status quo pressures people into doing. The goal is to exist outside of the binary, not to create new ones, and to recognize the fluidity of gender and sexuality. And this is why you should care so much about individuality in this debate. So onto rebuttal of like their point about intersectionality and representation, because I think that like this point kind of doesn't like really respond to the like idea of what this looks like that we give you at first. So they tell you that like the image of the queer community is like associated with being a white man and that this ignores specific issues. I think that like firstly, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because I think that like the way that it kind of has always been seen since like Stonewall is like, a big inclusion of like a very diverse range of people. I think that that's the purpose of the movement, and I think that it would have progressed to like a very accepting and diverse place in either world. I think that the examples that they give us, and I think this is very important because we are kind of arguing like different things here. The examples that they give us are things like twinks and bears as examples of like hyper-specific labels, but I think that a lot of these are colloquial personality terms, right? Like they don't identify with like what that person's like gender and sexuality is. It's more of just like a who do you associate with, what do you look like, how do you dress type of vibes. I don't think those are necessarily so harmful in this debate. I think the terms that we are talking about here are things like omnisexual, pansexual, demisexual, all of the examples that Cheryl gives you, because I think that like it is still possible to explore the specific problems faced by like personality groups without like having to like hyper-focus into these like labels that create all the harms we tell you about. I think in terms of intersectionality as well, the examples that they give are broad terms, right? Like they tell you about like, black trans people. I think that firstly, like black being a racial characteristic is not like an identity of the queer community. I think as well, like being transgender is like a medical fact. It's not like a label that we are assigning on people. I think that's why those terms don't apply in this debate. But I also think that it is still possible to achieve intersectionality on our side, because number one, like you don't need like hyper-specific labels in order to achieve intersectionality, because that looks like considering factors like both gender and sexuality at the same time. So being able to recognize that maybe gay trans people still have problems, I think that is still possible under broader labels. I think as well, considering the experiences of women in the queer community is still possible with a like broad label such as queer. I think as well, like because we are able to get better social change for the reasons that Cheryl tells you and for the reasons I tell you on the legitimacy of like being able to like, firstly you get more people in the movement because you lower that barrier for entry for people to come into the queer community, to feel accepted in the queer community, want to remain in that community and fight for it, but you also get better acceptance from people who are not entrenched in the community, who are able to better understand the things that you are fighting for, more willing to credit like social change efforts, and that is why we're still able to achieve benefits on intersectionality as well. So just finally on some whipping of like greater belonging in the community, I do want to go over this again because I feel like it's not necessarily I think it's very important in this debate. So firstly, we tell you about better accessibility. We tell you that there is less pressure to have like spec knowledge on the queer community, and this is very important because it allows people who are disconnected from this community to feel included, because often what happens is if you're like, you know, a jock gay man and you join the queer community and you don't know about all these like hyper-specific labels, you're going to feel a bit ostracized by that community, not necessarily accepted, particularly if you're from somewhere that like hasn't socialized you into understanding those. I think as well we tell you that like hyper-specific labels like this just don't work, right? Like people's experiences exist on a spectrum, and even if like you do manage to find like a label that is specific and suits exactly how you feel, it's likely to be hard for other people to understand, niche for them. You're not necessarily going to feel understood even if you do find something, and this just results in people feeling alienated, both because they have found like a label that nobody else understands, or because like, you know, they don't understand labels that other people are telling them about. We tell you about pressure to disclose. We also tell you about how groups within the community are singled out for discrimination, and that it reduces the capacity for collectivization. And I think this is very important because like what we are able to achieve from this is like less alienation, people feeling more like belonging within the community, but we also see like less reluctance to join, as well as less like likelihood for people to like leave the community. So yeah, I think, ooh, oh no, I've run out of material, but yeah, I think that the most important things in this debate are the experiences of people within the community and how well they feel accepted and belonging, because that is the entire purpose of the queer movement, is to give those people a space to exist safely and freely, and to not just enforce more labels on them, because that is the reason that like they do not feel like they belong in not like heteronormative society, is because they are having like, you know, expectations enforced upon them because of labels, and that is harmful for all the reasons we tell you. Thank you so much for watching.
Why would a rich white male actually push for like their identity and whatever? Somehow I think basically it's not only the problem of whether you feel that you actually belong to the community or not. You want to feel respected to the extent of your detailed existence. As in, you want to be nuanced in your life, you want to be nuanced in your identity, you want to be specific in what acceptance, in what experience you have in your life. First on acceptance and then later on buy-in. All the rebuttals and arguments can be integrated as well. First on rebuttal and acceptance. One first things on their side of the house saying that's then going to be increasing the bar and acceptance. Notice how the person themselves is going to be confused and don't even know should they opt in or not. This looks like asexual and aromantic communities are not going to be opting into this kind of queer community. Somehow they think this is too big of a blanket. They are unsure if they actually should opt in the first hand. They are unsure if the community is respectful to them. Notice how you only know that you're going to be respected the moment you join the community, and if you don't even join the community, none of the impacts actually going to be manifesting. So the entry barriers for their side of the house is already higher. This is how the communities on their side of the house, like I already said, right? Like right now, gay communities is being represented by twink. A lot of bear and hunk already not opting out of communities, how they think that they are not represented within the communities. This happened on a world scale on their side of the house, when twink people are going to be representing not only the gay community, but the community, the queer community in general. Basically because of how they have the first move of advantage, because of how they're the first one to be pushed, because of how there's no emphasis on the diversification of representation right now. This is how outside the house, when we have a queer communities, people know that there needs to be at least some quota or a diversified board of like directors or whatsoever. As in, they want to have a lesbian on the board, they want to have a pansexual on the board, they want to have a demisexual on the board. This means that there's actually advocating for many different things. This means that you actually feel safer when the stories of these people are matching yours. Second of all, you are uncomfortable and hard to label yourself. I have three responses to this. First, are people actually forced to label or not? I think this is unrealistic to a certain extent. 3 reasons for this. 1, people's main concern with the calm right now is respectful. This is how you want to be respected in your life. That's the reason why you are opting into this community. This is how you want to be treated, the way that you want to treat other people. Oh wait, it's the opposite way. You want to treat people the way that you want to be treated. You want to be respected, therefore you want to respect other people as well. Second of all, they were coerced in their life. Why would they coerce other people to do so? Trans women were coerced to choose whether they are women or not. Gay men are forced to choose whether they are man or female. Why would they do this to someone else? Third, even if the incentives still exist, this is harder, this is symmetrical on both sides of the house. When does this actually occur? This actually would only occur in like playground in your schools or whatever. This means this is outside the community. If this is the incentive that someone just forced you to label because of how they think that you're weird, i.e. schools have label for everyone. They want to label you as a jock, they want to label you as gothic girls or whatever. They're gonna do this symmetrically on both sides of the house. But in these instances, they're gonna be forcing the label on you with the umbrella terms that you don't necessarily relate with. This is ridiculously worse on their side of the house in that sense. Fourthly, there are umbrella terms right now. Because of how, aside from gay, trans, whatever, we have queer, we have curious, we have questioning. They are literally the Q in the LGBTQIA+. That's not even a foreign term to other people. You can just say, I'm queer, that's fine. I'm curious, that's fine. People also respect you and say, oh, that's good. No one cares about that as much. That's already been the case. Second of all, there's like, the last layer of right here is you are most left out from affirmative if you are into queer event and it's dominantly gay as well. If you're saying that you're forced to label and you're just like not accepted within the community. So how on their side of the house, the queer community is going to have a same event with no diversification of event. So how they don't feel the need to do so, or even if they feel the need to do so, they don't know how to do so. How do you actually diversify the amount of people without an actual term for them to a certain extent? Because of how in Australia right now we have WOC and POC diversify for the training regime for different reasons, right? That's the same things applicable here as well. And also second of all, they're saying that, oh, but people within the same label have different experiences. Yes, I do agree with this to a certain extent, but one, people within different label already have drastically different experience. I myself is not accepted by, say, bisexual by my mom. Somehow she said like quote by quote, she said that if I'm gay, she would just accept me and move on. But because of how I'm bisexual, I'm a slut. This is how I'm basically attracted to everyone in society. There's different reasons for you to be hate depending on the label that you're in. There are different life experiences, i.e. I might be questioning about my sexuality. I would not identify myself straightforward as gay. I would identify myself as questioning first, right? That's basically the nuance of it. On your side of the house, you are generalizing this even more because of how more people are being told that they are having the same experience. Assumptions harm people and detrimental to human mental health. That's already defeating majority of their case on acceptance. Notice how this is really important as the framing we gave you, but why it's hard for us to achieve changes in the long run, but it's easy for us and important to us to achieve changes right now for the people that we know that we care the most on. Second, on buy-in. Notice how they never actually explain why they're getting more buy-in. They just say, oh, people are confused. One, on conservative is gonna try to fuck you off anyway because of how they hate you. But also, second of all, there's a momentum being built on the progressivists. Well, how would I say this? If it's like, let's say, America in the 2000s, they would never accept trans. And therefore, if that's the situation, they would never accept the gay as well. So how for gay people, it's only the problem of like, oh, you might have HIV, you might don't have any kids. That's a different section of problem, right? All those problems are easier to solve to a certain extent because of how that social norms and just social norms in general. The trans people are being concerned with toilets, with sports, with you looks weird, you require testosterone, you are not natural. There's a different barrier of acceptance from people from the society. This also stretches into politics as well, as in there are different level of campaigning within politics. Therefore, on their side of the house, on just a macro level, already society don't accept and don't buy into your narrative. But on a micro level, basically people internally are having different acceptance. I already given in my examples before. So they differ from state to state, country to country. Therefore, the movement should be diversified as well on the phase they are on, focusing on one group next to another. Notice how this would not letting out people. Why? Because of how you're still being heard within the community. You're still having your input, like my first argument in the setup already proved. But also, second of all, why pushing all at once is going to be bad? One, there's going to be a dilution of political capital on their side of the house. This is how they are trying to solve a bigger chunk, which is not detailed. People don't know what are you actually pushing for. This is how unclear it is right now. It's really hard for you to actually solve it. Even if it's solved, the only instances that's going to be solved is either 100 years later, which is not urgent enough, and the urgency matters to humans' life. This is how your matters right now. And also, second of all, if it's happening right now, chances are it's a blanket, oversimplified solution. So you might get a weird level of acceptance, but not actual acceptance. You still feel bad from day to day. You still feel when it's understood. What's the actual outcome of it? Unclear what is important. And also, this is bad for any further momentum. This is how you cannot escalate this out. This is how people think that they already concede to you to a certain extent. They already concede and give you the amount of right that you require them to give you that amount of right. That's therefore the movement is going to be kind of a roadblock on their side of the house. On our side of the house, the solidarity I already explained to you why solidarity still exists. So therefore, they are because of how they want more bonded, because of how they are more respected. Second of all, they have more buy-in, like I said before. Less people are confused and actually opting into the movement in the first hand. And third of all, we are focusing on one problem as well. But in the long run, this is a momentum to just escalate it up. Like we saying in the status quo right now, the moment that we get right for the gay is the moment that we are one step closer to get right for the transgender people. So how basically they have some same problem but different nuances. Therefore, more momentum, more buy-in, more acceptance. I never power that to negate this motion.
We don't need to get claims like the intersectional sort of black trans things that they say. Instead, we can just get the other claims that they themselves concede. Things like bisexuality, things like aromantic, things like being asexual. And I would suggest that these are all vastly different things from just being queer or just being gay along those lines because of the things that we explain are the issues uniquely affecting these people. But importantly, the point of this argument is not to suggest that now that you have these labels, you are required to opt into them or that is important. It is a de-emphasis of the it is an emphasis on the importance of the individual experience. Because when every single gay person was labeled as gay, it meant that you did not have to listen in depth to those experiences. Because everyone was gay. You faced the same issues as that bisexual person, which meant that when they were talking about specifics, I didn't feel that, which means that that is less important. Comparatively, you legitimize those experiences on our side. It's a community that you can collectivize with. It is a community you can identify with, and it's a community that other people have to listen to. Because the reason why we knew bi erasure was a thing was because the bi community spoke out about it. We know that gay people are targeting them. Then in the comparative where these communities die out slowly, silently, and are drowned out by white fucking twinks. Firstly then, is this prescriptive? Secondly, on change. Firstly, is this prescriptive? I want to emphasize much of their material is contingent on explaining that these are specifically prescriptive. But we would actually flip this and explain it is their side which is far more likely to prescribe individual worlds onto people. So for example, this response to the claim that certain movements would prioritize certain groups, it will also I'll explain what it responds to lately. Why is it that it's such prescriptive on our side? And again, emphasis, yes, it is true that we do not claim specifically the invention of the roles of like bears and honors, but those are the things that logically come from an emphasis on the individual experience rather than just holistically you are gay. Firstly, it is our side that says that the individual identity is the most important thing and legitimizes those individual experiences as valid because of the fact that you are able to say that you are bisexual and that is valuable. And on their side, instead people just claim your issues and say we are facing the same thing, which means that necessarily you do not hear the same problems and you do not have the emphasis on those specific issues. Secondly, it is just easier for you to find other people because if you have a big, like one gay Reddit forum, how are you supposed to find the specific issues that says, well, I actually also kind of feel attracted to women. Does that mean that I'm straight or does that mean that I'm not gay? Because you just do not have the identifying labels, right? Comparatively, if you have terms where people are like, well, generally we feel these sorts of things, it's easier for you to seek out those communities, which means firstly, the communities get stronger and more established, which means it is easier for people to identify them. But secondly, it just means that those communities communities are more likely to discuss their issues because you can collectivize, right? It's not just individual people in individual places that I am aromantic. You instead have a whole aromantic movement that is able to get change. The third thing is that we would say that their side emphasizes the collective experience on one, because they say when, for example, you say at the queer meeting that I have something different, that, well, everyone experiences these issues and it is unimportant on their side. They say that, for example, that certain people, like the majority issues that the community is facing are the most important ones. And think about how, for example, early on in Stonewall, we had a support mostly from gay men because this was what was identified as being gay, because those narratives were able to dominate. And importantly, they individually silenced members within the movement, not in an active way, but those people died silently. But the last thing that we suggest is that obviously the subgroups within these groups, that is, it is not just you are aromantic and they must prescribe to a set of things. I would argue then on their side that if you believe this on our side, their side is far worse because it means you must be gay and prescribe to a specific set of claims. On our side, yes, you can be aromantic, but obviously that comes in different features and there's an acceptance of the fact that you might transition between them. Because the more specificity on our side, the more people understand that they might identify with different groups at different periods or point in time in their life, so the more accepting they are if somebody's, say, willing to shift between those groups, because it is just a relatively common experience. But lastly, we just objectively know on the status quo that you are not prescribed. You can say that you're questioning, you can say that you're queer, you can say that, for example, that I don't actually know what's going on, and people understand that because they were in the same situation you were in. What do they suggest on this point about you are going to be prescribed? The first is that, I guess you could interpret that claim as maybe culture might unintentionally pressure you to make identifications. Firstly, if you argue on conservative groups, it is unclear why these groups would seek to the lowest common denominator. Like, why isn't it they wouldn't first just ask the question, well, am I gay? And instead have the Wikipedia page of all the gender identities, right? I would suggest it's an easing in process where you first identify with the larger group and then go in. But secondly, what is the issue you're more likely to face? Is it an issue that there are too many identities for you to choose from, or you're overwhelmed, or you do not feel represented? We would explain that conservatives, people in conservative backgrounds, are the ones who face the issue of not feeling represented, or not feeling that the experience is being accepted. So in fact, it is our side that is better for those groups because they are able to find the community more effectively that most represents this. Their last claim on this is that this is actually beneficial because at Simho, which is basically, this means that the gay community now has to support, for example, more marginalized communities. Firstly, why would they care about those specific things on their side if you explain our mechanism on being silenced? And specifically, if you were being silenced by those larger communities, like the attack of the gay community towards bi communities, it's far easier for you to call that out, which is why we have a term for bi-erasure rather than just lacking the information on that. And secondly, we would explain the fragmentation happened post the majority of central claims. So this fragmentation happened as people were more people joined the community and it became more diverse. So to get the initial change of, for example, Stonewall, those sorts of stuff will fundamentally happen, and then past that point you kind of got that separation. But lastly, there's a reason it's an entire acronym. It is because the entire queer community feels solidarity with each other in the uniqueness of experience. Because yes, you are unique, but you are combined together as one, which just means it is far easier for you to get. This responds to the arguments about, firstly, conservative queers feeling bad because we explained they're more likely to feel better. But if they are not prescribed into thinking that, then obviously they're going to be better off under our side. Secondly, it responds to the things about shoehorning you into a specific group because it's not specific. But lastly, individual groups are being targeted as less vulnerable because this explains that those groups are more likely to have capital, more likely to have representation, more likely to have protection. Let us ask the second question on social change. And the first thing I want to point out is that both teams recognize that societal change may be a tad difficult, but that is why the Nevan specifically explains to no response why isn't you get better action individually in these communities, because the issues faced by somebody aromantic is vastly different from the issues faced by somebody who is gay, which means on the our side, when you join the aromantic subreddit, you read about those issues and you feel more accepted. So let's assume, best case scenario, more people opt into the queer community on their side. On the our side, their issues are actually able to be fixed, not necessarily in a societal sense, but you find more information and share experiences with other people. It's far more value and better experience for you as a person because your identity is being recognized and those issues you can actually face and put inside those specific change that you have there. Unresponded material, I think this is pretty important if you assume that general change is hard. What do they say on social change? The first is sort of marginal mechanisms that more people are likely to buy into the movement, therefore that means that you get a larger voting bloc. If you assume we win the first argument on prescriptiveness, then this argument also is somewhat marginal there. The second one, they say it's harder for allies to join me, or because it's more questioning. Firstly, we would suggest you get better people on their side, because on their side, it's the one straight guy who reads the one book about a gay man, now thinks he's the expert on queerness, but on our side, you're more willing to be open. Because yes, you might say that yes, I don't know about the experience, but I'm willing to learn. So we get more better people who are more likely to seek out and legitimize experiences, rather than their side, who instead says that I know everything and claim that that they have one singular identity. The second thing is that this is contingent on you actually being like shamed for it, but we would explain that if, for example, you just come in with the attitude of the genuine attitude of I, for example, just want to learn, or what are you, then that means that you're far more likely to instead be like more likely to be accepted on that. The last thing that we suggest, so this is why you're specifically broad and therefore likely to enter into. The last thing they say is that conservatives are likely to ridicule. I think fairly marginal as pointed out, because it's unclear why they ridicule you on this aspect as opposed to anything else. What are the clear mechanisms that do not receive a response? One, you get specific change, because even if they get more change, what the fuck is the point if they're never specific to the people that need them, because the problems faced by the bi community is vastly different from the ones of the gay community. Secondly, you get specific valuable change. So that is not on the issue, just the issues that are important, but is the way that it is manifested. All of these reasons oppose.
Everyone, thank you all very much for the debate. We all enjoyed the debate. We thought it was a pretty good debate at times. We thought the result ended up being a close but a reasonably clear debate. What I'll do is I'll give general feedback and answer the result and give the reasons for the result. First in general feedback, I think at times both teams today, to varying extents at varying speakers, were really assertive with their arguments. I think a lot more steps need to be taken to actually step through and prove a lot of things in today's debate. I think particularly a lot of assertions were made about the ways communities act and what they do. I think those could have been expanded a bit more to explain why they are likely to act that way or respond that way, both inside and outside the queer communities that are being talked about in the debate today. I think the second thing is that at times teams weren't very charitable or engaged in each other's best version of each other's cases. Again, something that varied from speakers, but I think it's always important to try and take on the best version of each other's cases, and often look, if you're concerned about like the headings or phrases that are used, to also look at the underlying analysis to make sure that that is the thing that's being responded to as well at the most deep level. The third thing in general feedback today, have my notes up the right way, was just, I think this debate at times talks about external responses, like how the non-queer community and political actors, etc., respond to the labels and choices that the queer community makes. I thought this is an area of the debate that could have been explored a bit more, and ultimately doesn't get much credit or doesn't really come up in the OA at all, as you'll see. Because I think there are two problems. Is one, it's never explained why it is justified or unjustified for the queer movement to modify its behaviour or its labels based upon the external critique of people outside that community, and then follow through as to why there's any practical consequence and what the impacts are, weighed up against the other impacts that exist in the debate, to sort of make that issue land. So I think if teams wanted to explore that issue, I think this is fertile ground in the debate, but those extra steps I think need to be taken to how it works out. All right, in terms of the result then, we had a unanimous decision and we awarded the debate to side negative. Congratulations. We thought there were broadly two issues in the debate. Firstly, looking at the individual, and secondly, looking at the success of the movement and its advocacy overall. Let's first look at the individual. I think the individual becomes probably the most important issue in the debate, both because the teams spend the most time on. I think both teams have some very good material on why individuals in this community, or in the broad sense of the community, finding a sense of self and belonging is the most important thing. Teams are discussing about how best to get there, which is the first reason I think this issue is more prioritised, and I'll explain why the movement issue becomes deprioritised when we get to that issue. On the sense of belonging, Affirmative think comes out quite well at the start of their speeches and tells us there's an important issue where lots of people in the struggle to find a specific label struggle to find that one label, particularly when they're from further removed communities at times like rural and regional communities or conservative communities, and that then it is hard to find a sense of belonging because you don't necessarily fit one label specifically or struggling to understand what it all means, and therefore you opt out of community altogether and can't find that sense of belonging. I guess as a note of observation first, we did have a question on the panel at times about how difficult it is to find or identify in some of those labels. Like some of those labels seemed more easy to identify with than others just because they come from those communities, etc. wasn't quite clear. However, we do think negative also gives a series of responses as to why that initial entry into the community is likely to not be as negative or as ostracizing as what Affirmative says. The first one we hear from First Negative is that there are labels in and of themselves that cover the things that Ash is talking about. So things like queerness is a broad enough label if you're unsure, but also questioning is another definition of the Q, which means individuals who are unsure can still access the community via that way. But also that the idea that those broad caption areas allow you to sort of like step in as you like, a sort of stepping stone as it's described at third, that allow you to sort of take one step in, figure out a bit more, and then go further and deeper as you go along. We thought particularly this was expanded quite well at Second Negative, explaining a bit more as to why the queer community is not likely to act in the ways that Affirmative was talking about. That looking like one, that the experience is of change in identity and change in gender and sexuality, something lots of people can empathise with, so particularly trans communities and the changes they've experienced can empathise with that. But secondly, lots of people in queer community have gone through that questioning process themselves, so are likely to have also have empathised with those individuals because they've had it gone through in the past. But I think also second Edith points out that I don't think it's fully the panel didn't think it was fully explained from side affirmative exactly why the community would act this way and force you to like demand to know your identity, etc., enough to be credited in today's debate. There is some push from after, like it's the norm, everyone asks you to do it, etc. I think that like is again falls into that little bit assertiveness part of the debate, like it's just the norm, people do it. I think Neg explains some good reasons as to why, given the experiences individuals have, is not necessarily likely to be that much of a pressure or that much of a norm. What I think then we get from negative in response to the sense of belonging is this idea that the capacity to self-actualize is particularly important, and the broader the label, you actually have more trouble being able to fit into that because it is so disparate. And you're better, and the more specific you get, the more likely you are to find something that relates more to you, and that is where you find a greater sense of self-actualization and belonging. There's a bit of back and forth here about like bears and otters and whether those labels are characteristics of people or whether they are the identities and labels we're talking about in today's debate. The panel was willing to believe that those things did fall under the debate and were reasonable characterizations and categories of what this debate could be about, but also we credit negative because they also do engage in the stuff that affirmative talks about as well in terms of the demi, pan, etc. They also add those examples in, which I think also means that they cover the analysis. I think affirmative unfortunately focuses too much on the bashing of the examples and the words chosen without necessarily looking at the analysis that comes underneath, because all the logic and reasoning flows beyond that as to why those things are, why that still works, and why having more labels allows you to better find who you are, and again the sense of belonging that both teams want for those individuals. I think there's also a question here about the sort of regret and that nature going back to Stonewall and who was in charge of the Stonewall riots and what that image had. I have a few questions about exactly who was involved in the Stonewall riots based on what happened in this debate and what my understanding of history. But that's aside from the debate. If we believe that, as the debate sets up, that it was like an image dominated by like the sort of like white twink dudes overall, I think what Neg's able to explain is that the more you generalize, the harder it is people who don't meet that criteria to get in. So given a historical precedent of that being the thing you see, because it's all generalized and norm and those power plays puts us to the top, it is even harder for people to come in and access. So we prefer a world with these more specific labels so people can sort of skip past that part and enter into the bit that reflects their label more accurately and gets them into to find their sense of belonging a bit better as well. The other claim from AFWE here is that labels change over time, and that means that they're an ineffective or poor use of labels. And that's part of the problem with more generic labels, so you can reflect individuals whose experience change as they grow and as they develop. I think that what Neg is able to do, and this kind of links back to what we were saying earlier, to identify that it is not necessarily impossible or difficult to move between those labels, and having some unsurety is acceptable within the community overall. And I think also that it is better that, even though it might still be somewhat harder to move between those labels, it's still better over time to find something that's more accurate to you than what it would otherwise have been. There's a little bit of stuff here from AF around communities, like individual groups locking you out of that community if you don't necessarily specifically identify with that, or you're unsure if you can access certain spaces. I think we agree with the fact that this is not an easy process for anyone trying to figure out these identities and these communities. But I think the pushback we get from Neg in response is that, like, if you're not sure you even fit a generic label, you're even more locked out in those circumstances than what you would be in a case where you're just trying to figure out the more specific label there. So given it's overall difficult, we thought the individual impacts of finding sense of belonging were better done by side negative because they were more specific and more unique to the individual. Looking at the movement then, the first thing I note here in terms of advocacy for change is the way we get given it first negative about why social movement like macro change should be less important today. So that was actually quite persuasive to how the panel ended up weighing these issues, that being that the speculative change we can get from politicians in society is likely to be quite limited and also not likely to be massively affected by the labels individuals choose. As we hear later in speeches, like conservatives are going to hate them whatever labels they choose, I think does reduce to some extent the importance of this issue relative to the individual issue. But I think but on this issue and what we do here though, affirmative tells us from the start you want to build political capital by having everyone together under similar labels. The more people you're in the movement, the stronger you are. I think the first note I'd make here is just, again, a bit of an observation of that argument. One, it's unclear there's a whole bunch of people who currently aren't in the community that now would join the community that increase that number. And the second concern thought we had on this issue that made it difficult to judge it or to credit it rather, was it was never proven that there is in this current status quo structure of the queer movement, that everything operates at such a diluted level. These movements don't ever work together or protest together, etc. So it didn't create a sort of a believable worldview for the judges about why the movement is so fractured now, why these labels specifically cause such a fracturing in the movement that can never operate as a one big group. However, outside of our thoughts, we think that negative also has some good responses as to why our movement is actually not necessarily stronger in the way that affirmative wants it to be and is better on that side. The first is to say that often these groups hurt each other. So the issue of advocacy for trans rights can sometimes come at the cost of queer rights in a political advocacy sense, and that of gay rights, and that then becomes an issue. We're trying to work together of who gets that priority and what hurts the other person. But secondly, they do a very good explanation across their bench as to why often these issues are very distinct and different, and you can't have a macro group representing all of them because its interests are likely to be different and unique to those groups, and you need individualization to better able to advocate for them and to understand them. And thirdly, they also put that the momentum builds one on another. So as smaller groups start to have some success, it builds and snowballs for other groups as well. I think there was enough response back from affirmative that really clarified or developed over the bench in response to the material we get from negative as to exactly how the social movement stuff works or changes, which meant it was harder to credit, and we think affirmative gets up on, so negative gets up on this. The last thing on negative on how they help with the movement issue and advocacy for change, I think they make a very good point about change or understanding advocacy inside the movement and why it is better for individuals to be able to use the Reddit example they use, go to a specific subreddit for their specific identity, and that's where they find resources and can discuss and push for change, etc., more relevant to them, and it is more ostracizing, more difficult to understand the issues or push for change in a very generic sense when the Reddit, to use that example, is just one generic thing for everybody, which I think ultimately means that in terms of the advocacy for change, I think if somebody's able to fully prove that the movement looks the way they want it to do and they can achieve significantly more change because of this particular change, whereas negatives able to point out there are some benefits to the way this movement operates and some costs to trying to put together. So they win the movement stuff and they win the individual stuff, and that's why they take the debate. Hope that all made sense. Thank you again everyone very much for the debate. If you'd like to chat to any of us, any of the three of the people on the panel, I'll be very happy to give feedback. They'll have great thoughts.